Once again, we've appreciated your support, the community support, and especially the support of the English Bonner Mitchell Foundation, as well as our media sponsors, Wayne TV, News Channel 15, and Northeast Indiana Public Radio. We ought to have a really interesting, provocative, exciting lecture tonight from Christopher Buckley, as usual. We'll have a question and answer session afterwards. Once again, I think we've trained you right. Now we have these microphones that, so that everybody can hear your questions. That's really important, so please use the microphones. And there will be Mr. Buckley's availability for a book signing after the lecture out in the lobby of Reinhardt. So without further delay, I would like to introduce Dacia Charlesworth, who is an associate professor in our communications department. She teaches rhetoric, among other things, which makes her an incredible introducer. She intends to elocute beautifully as she gives this, this introduction. So with that, Professor Charlesworth.
I am, as Dr. Wartell mentioned, a rhetorician. Unfortunately, in my experience, though, most members of the general public have no idea what rhetoric means. Now, of course, we hear the word rhetoric bandied about during election times, but it's almost always used in a pejorative sense. The word rhetoric, though, is steeped in a historic tradition. With grammar and logic, rhetoric forms the trivium upon which the foundational tenets of liberal education rest. Now, there are a lot of definitions of rhetoric. My favorite, though, comes from Aristotle. He defines rhetoric as the faculty of observing, in any given case, all the available means of persuasion. Now, tonight's speaker, Mr. Christopher Buckley, is often described as a writer, but I'd like to think of him as one of us. I'd like to think of him as a rhetorician. And when you read his work and you see his keen insights and his ability to analyze an audience, you know this is true. When he was trying to figure out where to publish his endorsement of Obama, he discusses his decision to not publish it in the National Review, but instead to publish it on the Daily Beast. Now, of course, when some National Review readers learned of Buckley's traitorous acts, they immediately called the National Review, said that they would not renew their subscriptions, and they would not donate any more money to the magazine. Because of his fondness for the National Review, and in a good faith effort, Mr. Buckley tendered his resignation to the editor of the National Review, who then actually accepted it. Now, to show you that you can't always analyze your audience as well as you'd like, Mr. Buckley very carefully reminds us, always be careful to whom you tender your resignation, for you never know who will actually accept it. You've read your programs. You know of Mr. Buckley's remarkable accomplishments. But for me, his most moving work, what resonates with me, it's not one of his novels, it's not a magazine column, and it's not a newspaper column. Oh no. It's his uncredited role in the movie Thank You for Smoking. He played Man at Metro Station. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored and privileged to introduce to you the man at Metro Station, Mr. Christopher Buckley.
The man at Metro Station. I've never heard that before. Hello, Fort Worth. Gotcha. My late father announced his retirement from public speaking here in Fort Wayne maybe 5 years ago. And if I fail tonight, I may have to announce my retirement from public speaking. But thank you, Daisha, for that lovely introduction. It's a funny thing about introductions and descriptions. You know those about the author paragraphs on the back flaps of the books, the ones that writers pretend that they didn't write, you know, that say, considered a leading voice of this generation. Oh, I didn't write that. Well, after 7 or 8 books, I've written 14, I sort of got bored with them and started making them up. And on this particular book, I think it was a novel called Little Green Men, I wrote, he has been an advisor to every American president since William Howard Taft. So I was about 10 days into a book tour, which is a peculiar form of torture that really, I think instead of waterboarding at Abu Ghraib, they ought to just put them on a book tour, and I bet they'd tell us where those weapons of mass destruction really are. But I was about 10 days into a book tour, and you get a little punchy on those, and I was walking into a radio interview. It was a AM drive time radio show. Now there's a hierarchy out there, and you know, at the top you have All Things Considered and Terry Gross of Fresh Air. They're like up here. Down here, you have the AM drive time talk jocks. And I walked into the studio, and the host, to use a slightly generous term for the office that he actually performed, was hunched over the about the author paragraph on the back of my book. And I knew right away that this was all he would know about me, the book, possibly the universe. And he was sort of beetle-browed, speed reading this thing. And he looked up at me and said, "You were an advisor to William Howard Taft?" And as I say, I was about 10 days into this book tour. I said, yeah, I was. And he said, so we could talk about that? I said, yeah, we could. And we did. And I haven't been invited back, but it was worth it. It was worth it. I'm sometimes described as a satirist, which is an unwieldy term. I don't really know what a satirist is. Maybe a first responder to American absurdity. But whatever I am, it's good. It's very good to be here with you. I flew here from my home town of Washington, D.C. Dear old D.C., as President Kennedy described it, a city of northern charm and southern efficiency. I used to write speeches for George Herbert Walker Bush, not the other Bush, the Bush the Antichrist. And if it was an out-of-town speech, he liked to begin it by saying, it's great to be here in Fort Wayne, here in the real America. And this was intended to signal the audience that he was not that most vile of creatures, the inside the Beltway person, never mind that he was Vice President of the United States. I got so used to typing this, it just sort of saturated my reflexes that I typed it as an introduction to a speech he gave once in Toronto. And that went over really well. Canadians love it when you call them the real Americans. We're Canadians, eh? Anyway, since this lecture tonight is sponsored by an Institute of Higher Learning, I thought I would talk to you tonight about healthcare reform. I see this mass exodus to the... What time does the movie start? Oh, we'll be late. No, don't worry. I'm not going to talk about healthcare reform. I thought I might, since it is a university, and universities tend to be bookish places, at least ideally, I would talk to you tonight about what I consider one of the pressing challenges facing the writer in America today. Hiding money from the IRS. Just kidding. Coming up with a good title. Coming up with a good title. There are a lot of books published in America today. Anyone care to hazard a guess how many books are published in the United States every year? 400,000. Of course, half of those are by John Grisham. But, you know, a book is like any other product. It needs to be packaged. People make impulse decisions. You know, I'm essentially in the same kind of business that Kellogg's is in. You know, should we buy Buckley's new book or get some grape nuts? Let's get the grape nuts. And, you know, in the old days, historically speaking, you could pretty much call your book anything. The Divine Comedy, Don Quixote, the Gutenberg Bible. Those are all good titles, but it didn't really matter. No one could read anyway. But literature is full of some interesting titles that almost came into being. I always think of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wanted to title The Great Gatsby Trimalchio in East Egg. Catchy. Trimalchio is the rich patron in Petronius's Satyricon, but you already knew that. Or take another influential writer of the 20th century, Adolf Hitler. Hitler's original title for Mein Kampf, that lighthearted comedy, was 4.5 years of struggle against lies, stupidity, and cowardice. I know, but would you have wanted to be Hitler's editor? Tell him the title sucks. No, you tell him. Let's get Werner to tell him. Werner, tell the Fuhrer the title sucks. Werner, come back. Werner? Sometimes titles run into problems when they're translated overseas, and this very famously happened to John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, which appeared in Japan under the title Angry Raisins. Just imagine generation after generation of Japanese school kids, you know, reading Angry Raisins. You wonder how Moby Dick made out. Really angry whale. According to the New York Times, there have been some interesting modern Chinese translations of movie titles. Apparently, in China, they prefer literal titles. None of this artsy stuff like Angry Raisins. That's for the Japanese. So in Canton, the movie Leaving Las Vegas, do you remember that some years ago? That appeared under the title, I'm Drunk and You're a Prostitute. Field of Dreams, now I know you're familiar with that movie. That appeared in China under the title, Imaginary Dead Baseball Players Live in My Cornfield. Yeah. What's it about? Well, there's this guy. The Crying Game, do you remember that movie? That appeared in China under the title, "Oh no, my girlfriend has a penis." But my favorite was the Cantonese translation of the movie Interview with the Vampire, which appeared under the title, "So, you're a lawyer." Just quoting the New York Times. Who knew it was so funny? Peter Benchley. Peter Benchley had a very hard time coming up with a title for his first novel, and he and his editor were working against a deadline. They had about 20 minutes to go, and the editor saying, look, we need a title. And they had narrowed it down to 3, Leviathan Rising, The Shark, you probably know what book we're talking about, and The Jaws of Death. And finally, Benchley's father, Nathaniel Benchley, son of Robert Benchley, the great American humorist, proposed as a title, "Who's That Noshing on My Leg?" Doesn't have quite the same, so the opening credits, boom, 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 boom. Who's that noshing on my leg? It's a comedy! Oh God, oh God. Numbers in titles can be tricky, and the late Joseph Heller's classic Catch-22 has entered the language so permanently that it's a phrase we use almost every day, usually to describe an experience at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Heller's original title was Catch-18, but he'd been working on the book for 7 or 8 years, and then just as they were preparing to publish his book, Leon Uris brought out a novel titled Mila 18, which I'm sure some of you have read. So they said to Heller, we can't call it Catch-18, and Heller was crushed. So he just changed it to Catch-22, which is why you didn't have a Catch-18 experience at the DMV today. It doesn't have quite the same, whatever. But so historically, titles have proved tricky, but they're very important. Some years ago, I was bringing out my first collection, a collection of comic essays, and this is a big moment in any writer's life when you have enough material finally to recycle. Let's see what we have in the drawer here. Oh, old pieces. Let's see if here, oh, maybe there's money here. Publishers hate it because they really don't sell, but if, sometimes they sort of, just to please you, they have to bring them out, but it's usually grudging. But this was my first collection, so I was, a little pumped up with some self-importance here. Very rare in writers, self-importance. We tend to be a very self-effacing, altruistic lot, So I said, well, let's call it oeuvre to you. Oeuvre, being the classy French word for collection, body of work. Yeah, that was pretty much their reaction. The trouble is when an American says oeuvre, it sounds like you're about to throw up. And this is not, appealing to a publisher. So they said, why don't we not, tell you what, great idea, Buckley, let's not call it that. So it was back to the drawing board, and I said, okay. And so I said, I know, let's call it Ruined Weekends. Because those of you who have had any experience in journalism, or really in many other walks of life, know that it's an inflexible rule that it's due on Monday. And most of the 50 pieces in this book had been due on a Monday and had ruined a weekend. And I thought, this was sort of a stately title. You could see it sort of stamped on the spine of one of those books in the opening tracking shot of Masterpiece Theater, You know, like you know, David Copperfield, Mein Kampf, Ruined Weekends. And the publisher said, no, you know, that's kind of downbeat. Downbeat. Publishers are they're obsessed with things being upbeat. I'm not putting myself at all in the same category, but I'm not sure today Gibbon could get away with decline and fall of the Roman Empire. You know, they'd probably make him call it something like how kinky sex and lead goblets brought about the decline of the Roman Empire and how it can rise again. You can see it on Oprah, right? So what's the future of the Roman Empire? Well, I'm bullish on the Roman Empire, you know. The Visigoths are gone, you know. We have traffic lights now. It's an airport, which we named after Leonardo da Vinci. So they said, no, let's not call it that. So it was, again, back to the drawing board. So I thought and thought. Said, I know, let's call it Want to Buy a Dead Dictator. You liked it. But some explanation required. Back in the early 90s, I was editing a publication of Forbes magazine called FYI. So I had a magazine, which is a nice thing to have. And this was back in the days when, you know, poor old Boris Yeltsin was having to stand up on a tank every 5 weeks to stop a coup, you know. And I became sort of obsessed with the thought that though the Russians had gotten rid of communism, the god that failed, they still had Lenin, the embalmed corpse of Lenin, in a glass case on Red Square. The lines are shorter now. There being alternative things to do on a Saturday night in Moscow. But in those days, the lines were still quite long. And so that, you know, there he was, the sort of sleeping beauty from hell. And I thought, well, let's give Mr. Lenin a little nudge. And so I confected a hoax article that was to run in the next issue of the magazine. And I wrote it in a very deadpan. You have to be deadpan if it's a hoax. You can't say, ah, this is funny. This is funny. And it said that we have received reliable information. Yeah, you can take this one to the bank. That the Russians are now so strapped for hard currency that they are going to auction off the corpse of Lenin. But they have concerns about this. That it should be done in a dignified manner, and that there are rules. The corpse cannot be used for any crass commercial reasons, purposes. It can't be used to, you know, advertise underarm deodorant or floor wax, you know. And so I had to, and it would, to ensure that this is a dignified process, they are insisting that it be a sealed bid auction. And now I had to come up with an opening price. Today, this is before eBay. Today, you could just put it on eBay, and you would know within 10 seconds what the market was for a dead commie. But I had to guess, this being 1991, so I figured 15 million sort of felt about right. I mean, right? You say 14 million? Okay. Said, 15 million. So just before publication, we, late one afternoon, about 4:30, we faxed it out to about 30 or 40 news outlets. Remember fax machines? This was, about the time the newspapers and wire services, whatever, were preparing their stories for the next day. This was still more or less back in the days when news came out once a day instead of all day. And the switchboard lit up like a Christmas tree. So we went home. So we wouldn't have to lie. We were journalists, we have ethics. We're serious people. So a few hours later, I was on my Nordic track ski machine in my ever futile Battle of the Bulge. And I was watching, as I always did, Peter Jennings of World News Tonight. And, oh my God, it's him. I'm doing this, and up comes Lenin's face. And I thought, holy shit. I felt like, we thought maybe an AP wire service story. No, Peter Jennings went with it. I felt sort of like, remember when you were 8 or 9, you were a kid and you put a little rock on the railroad tracks, and the next day the grown-ups were talking about the derailment? And you're like, ah. So the next morning, my phone rang at 7 in the morning, and it was Steve Forbes, whom you probably know as an occasional presidential candidate, but who my relationship sort of was with him was that he was the guy whose name appeared on my paycheck. And this was, in fact, the only call I'd ever received from Steve Forbes, and it was not yet 7:01. And he said, the Russians have gone ballistic. It was a little bit like the scene in the movie Dr. Strangelove where, he said, Mr. President, it's Premier Kissoff on the line, and he's hopping mad. Hello, Dmitri. Hello, Dmitri. So I spent a busy day on the phone. The interior minister of Russia was not amused, and had to break into Russian television programming. He had to break into the Russian Oprah. The mind boggles. Oprah with a wart in the middle of her forehead. I was puzzled about that. During the Cold War, here was a country with 30,000 nuclear warheads and no dermatologists. Everyone had a wart. Or like a huge birthmark, right there. I mean, what's with that? You've got 30,000 nuclear weapons. Don't you have laser surgery? So he went out of his way to denounce me personally as a brazen liar and an international provocateur. And I thought, cool. But eventually, everyone recovered their senses of humor. And then 6 months later, I was on the train going up to New York from Washington, and I opened my Washington Post, and there was a six-column headline, Kremlin deluged with offers for Lenin. That this had been a hoax became a front-page New York Times story, but it had been a hoax. Apparently eluded the 900,000 readers of Forbes, who, the people who run the dynamos of American capitalism, who are indeed some of you here, who apparently are too busy making money to read the newspapers. And the top bid had come in from Dallas, Texas, for $37 million. And it was accompanied, this bid was accompanied by a letter that had a sort of a sweet innocence to it. Only an American could have written this. He wrote, we've just completed our new corporate headquarters down here in Dallas, and I've discussed this with our interior decorator. And he says Mr. Lenin would make a fine addition to our lobby. So I said to my publisher, hey, I can tell this story to the AM talk jock, who thinks I've been an advisor to William Howard Taft. Yeah, I think he'll swallow it. But the publisher said, no, the word dead, the word dictator, these aren't happy. This isn't like, please don't eat the daisies. So it was back to the drawing board. So I thought, and there was rereading the pieces, and I came across one about Tom Clancy. I said, I know, okay, let's call it Homage to Tom Clancy. Now, this was an ironic title, but I thought it might be mistaken for the real thing by 5 billion Tom Clancy fans who would make me accidentally rich. The background was that the New York Times had asked me to review one of his novels, and I was a big fan of Mr. Clancy's early work, like The Hunt for Red October, which is one heck of a story. But when he was starting out, his books were, sort of normal size, and as happens when they start paying you $10 million for a book, they get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So I couldn't resist quoting in my review something that Mark Twain had said about a book by Henry James, to wit, once you put it down, you can't pick it up. Well, Mr. Clancy didn't like that, though really it didn't matter what any reviewer, much less a pipsqueak like myself, said about any of his books. He had, by this point, long since reached that happy Valhalla of being utterly review-proof. Still, apparently had a little ego. And so the next day, my fax machine, one of those heavy jobs, began to rumble and spit, and smoke was coming out. You remember thermal paper? Well, it was melting. I had little puddles of melted thermal paper. And it was hate fax from Tom Clancy. But what worried me was this fax machine had an unlisted number. I thought, oh my God, he's got the CIA, to provide my, what's next, ninja assassins? So he was not a happy camper. And he had, I think, gone to Bartlett's Familiar Quotations and found just, le mot juste. And he concluded this tirade with, he said, as for the, bulk of your review, Dr. Johnson said it best. He said, a fly may sting a stately horse, but it remains a fly. So, But now I had his fax number. So I wrote back. I said, well, dear Tom, I may be the fly, but you're still the horse's arse. And that did it. There was naval barrage, F-14 Tomcats. My house was reduced to a smoking ruin. So I said, what about Homage to Tom Clancy? My publisher said, no, let's not annoy 5 billion Tom Clancy fans. Let's just not go there. So it was once again back to the drawing board. And now, sort of everyone's mood is slightly changed. I suspect the publisher said to his lawyers, see if we're legally obliged to publish this book. I think there's something there on the page 7, paragraph 16, about the morals clause. So I thought, and I said, well, I know, I've got it. And now, every time I said to them, I've got it, they've flinched, like they were going to be hit. I said, let's call it dual airbags. Well, here was my reasoning. This was a phrase that, was very, this is a selling phrase. At the time, this is what people care about. The guys, when they go in the showroom, they want to know, does it come in red and with more horsepower? And the wife is saying, does it have dual airbags? Does it have the airbags over here, too? I want the... Now, there's so many airbags. Every time you get in the car, turn on the ignition, you fear you're going to be smothered by exploding airbags. So, but I reasoned that if this was a phrase that could sell a $40,000 car, why not a $20 book? The trouble was that my editor, being a New Yorker, had never heard of airbags. He thought they were the things they give you on airplanes. And so once again, the vomit motif had entered in, and they were not. That was not a really attractive motif to them. So now we're getting a little tight on the deadline, and they said, why don't you just let us title it? I said, no. And I said, okay, I've really got it this time. They go, yeah, what? I said, let's call it Look Out, President Park. Yeah, your reaction is pretty much what theirs was. But here was the story behind that. When I went to work in the White House in 1981, and Hinckley had just shot President Reagan. John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln to avenge the South, and John Hinckley shot President Reagan to impress Jodie Foster. And there, in a way, you have the trajectory of idealism in the American political assassin. But still, it was, an attention-getting event. And if you were a member of the traveling staff, or what the French would more elegantly call the entourage, you got a briefing from the Secret Service, basically, on what to train us to be sort of an extra pair of ears and eyes, and suspicious audiences like this to know that this guy in the front is trouble. Oh, I suppose your name is actually Wayne? Yeah, right. You expect good cover. So this briefing consisted of sitting in a darkened basement room in the old executive office building, which is the lovely building next to the White House that looks like a Victorian wedding cake, watching home assassination movies, sort of America's least funny home videos. We had the Zapruder film, Backward and Forward, with commentary by Secret Service. We had Arthur Bremer shooting George Wallace. And these were, very grim films. But one was really quite remarkable, and it was an attempt. Why am I laughing about this? On President Park of South Korea. And President Park is at a podium, much like this, speaking to slightly larger audience, maybe 5,000 people. I make this about 4,000. And Mrs. Park, the First Lady of South Korea, is sitting here on a chair, sort of looking up, wearing the expression of, oh my, this is the most Shakespearean oration I think I've ever heard. How wonderful to be here. Oh boy, I'm so happy. And it's probably a speech about the 5-year plan to dump Hyundais on the American auto market. And the stage is swarming with Korean Secret Service guys, with the dark glasses and actually, like drawn machine guns. They're sort of looking, don't you move, So President Park is speaking, and again, this is not particularly funny, but a man gets up and starts to walk down the center aisle. And he, calm as can be, quite casual, almost pausing to smoke a cigarette on the way. And he gets to about there and reaches into his jacket and pulls out a .357 Magnum revolver and sort of takes his time getting comfortable, getting a good platform. You want a good platform. He's like doing that. and starts blanging away at the podium. You know, bang, 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 bang. So President Park just goes like this. He just goes like this. As though this happens all the time. You can almost hear him going, God, I hate this part. I'm dying up here. You know? But now his Secret Service detail senses that something is wrong. You can't fool these guys. Highly trained, panther-like reflexes. And one of them, so they start spraying machine gun fire into the crowd. Yeah, this is a bit of a mess, really. And then one of them did something that I thought was sort of interesting from a career point of view. He runs over and takes cover behind Mrs. Park. Here. And he's trading shots with the guy, using the First Lady as a shield. You know, I'm watching this. And to be honest, I was just a pot-smoking English major who had gone to Washington to do a speechwriting gig, but I was starting to have a sort of, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, Toto moment. So now the room is very quiet, and the agent says, giving us the briefing, says, you know, we don't do it this way. I said, great, yeah, that's good. And he said, well, basically, here's what it boils down to. If something goes down, you've got two options. And I go, yeah, I'm writing this down. And he says, you can duck, or you can take the round. I said, what was the second part? You know, fond as I was of George Herbert Walker Bush, I was reasonably certain if it came to that, I would probably go for the duck option. So I said to the publisher, so, you know, let's call it that. And I can tell this story to the, you know, the drive time guy. And they said, no, you know, Korean presidents, they don't really, like, move books. So I said, well, we've got to call this thing something. So, which probably accounts for the next title I came up with, which was FedEx, Lax, and Other Mergers. But my wife said, no, I will divorce you if you call it that. So I thought and thought, and I said, okay, are you sitting down? And then, actually, they were leaving. I said, let's call it Bass Holes. Yeah, that was pretty much their reaction. But there was a piece in the collection. It was something I'd written for the New Yorker, which was a parody in the form of reviews in brief on the newest batch of books about fly fishing. Now, I do a bit of fly fishing myself. Fly fishing basically used to be fly fishing. You would stand in ice cold water up to your delicate parts and cast all day and catch nothing. But you go home, have a drink, and you'd have a perfectly nice day, right? You know. But then, you know, people started investing fly fishing with sort of mystical content, and books began appearing, you know, fly fishing through the midlife crisis, or fly fishing through the divorce, or, you know, finding God through fly fishing. And people would have actually debates, you know, it was the Apostle John, a dry fly fisherman, or I think he was a nympher myself, you know. And you'd go to Barnes & Noble, and it would be, you know, fiction, nonfiction, fly fishing. So I thought, well, let's have some fun with that. So I wrote, 6 brief paragraphs on the 6 new books about fly fishing. There was the new novel by Peter Benchley, Gills, about a vengeful trout. Then the exciting climax involves a squadron of Canadian F-15 fighter planes and a canoe paddle. But there was one of the books was called Bass Holes, and this was an attack on bass fishermen by a very prissy dry, barbless fly, catch and release type. You know the type, God forbid you should actually eat this fish that you've spent 4 days trying to catch. Oh, no, no. You can't eat it. It is sacred. It's a fish. So it came out in the New Yorker, and this being America, people started going to the Barnes & Noble and asking for these books. And the one they really wanted was Bass Holes. And so they'd go to the guy at the counter and say, I can't find Bass Holes. And so he'd go, no, we don't have that. I read about it in the New Yorker. He goes, no, we still don't have it. So they started calling the New Yorker, and the New Yorker referred the calls to me, and now I'm getting calls. So I said to Random House, my publisher, I said, look, I've done the market research. There is a hunger out there in the land for a book called Bass Holes. Trust me on this, And they said, no, Buckley, we're not going to call this Bass Holes. We're just not. So this sort of goes to my point, to the extent I have a point, about the futility of writing satire in America. You are in a hopeless competition with USA Today. You may remember what Yogi Berra said when he was told that a Jewish woman had been elected mayor of Dublin. Only in America. You remember Tom Lehrer? That was the week that was. He was a very, very funny satirist. He announced that he was giving up satire when Henry Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize. He said there was absolutely no point in doing satire anymore. One of the revelations of Bob Woodward's 17th book about the Iraq War was that Henry Kissinger had been advising President W. Bush. And I thought, when I read that, I went, I saw that movie back in the 60s, and it didn't end well, But I would love to have been a fly on the wall for those talks. You can just see it. Henry, God damn it, this thing's all screwed up. What do we do? And Henry announced that you have a secret plan to end the war. Oh, Henry, that's brilliant. Damn, that's great. So what's the plan? There is no plan. That's the secret. But I would be, I would really be hard pressed to come up with any hypothetical situation that could top American reality. You may know the story of the teenage boy who has to do a paper for school on the difference between hypothetical and reality. And so he goes into his dad's study one night and asks if he'll help him. And his father thinks for a moment. He says, well, go ask your mom if she'd sleep with a total stranger for $1 million. And so kid goes off, and he comes back pretty quickly and reports that the answer is, you bet. So he says, well, go ask your sister. And he comes back, lickety-split, and reports the answer is totally. He goes, well, there you go. Hypothetically, we're sitting on $2 million. In reality, we're living with a couple of hookers. So I still needed a title. So by now I know that they had a whole team of lawyers vetting the contract to see if there was an escape clause. And I said, okay, let's call it Oval Sex in the Oral Office. And the story behind that is that my darling little girl, my daughter, was about 10 when that was going on. And one night she came into my study and said, "Dad, what's oval sex?" "What's that, princess?" "Well, really?" I was like, "Thank you, Mr. President." Said, "Well, you know, Rebecca told me that people are mad at the president because he had oval sex in the oral office." This was like, you know, Art Linkletter, remember the author? This is like Art Linkletter on LSD. So I thought about it, and I finally did what any conscientious father would do. I told her to go ask her mother. They said, no, we're not going to call it oval sex in the oral office. So I still needed a title. So I said, I took a deep breath, and I said, okay, let's call it Thoo. And yeah, well, he liked it. When I was 29 when I went to work at the White House, and this was, you know, a kind of a, you know, a personal Mr. Smith goes to Washington. I was feeling, you know, I was going to be the chief speechwriter to the Vice President of the United States. Whoa. And I thought, you know, I was kind of dewy-eyed and young, thin, brown hair. And I thought, this is going to be huge. You know, this is, my speeches are going to be, you know, published in full on the front page of the New York Times, and they're analyzed in the Kremlin, and it's going to change the course of history. And then I got there, and within about 72 hours, figured out that no one cares what a vice president says. Well, you saw what happened to Mr. Quayle, right? Oh, they cared what he said, yeah. But not about what my guy said. You know, we could never get press coverage for Mr. Bush. You know, we'd put out press releases saying, Mr. Bush will be speaking, and it's going to be major, big. And you hear this, yeah, click. The only press coverage we got was the guy from C-SPAN who would come and set up his camera on a tripod in the back of the room, then go in the lobby and smoke. This is just in case someone shot him. So they'd have B-roll. And, but then one day in December of 1981, the Cold War heated up. Do you remember the Cold War? Don't you miss the Cold War? It was so much more fun than this one. There were rules, you know. The Poles declared martial law, and Russian tank divisions were moving into Poland, and we went from, you know, the leaves were canceled. You know it's serious when they cancel the leaves. You know, return to the base. We're going from DEFCON 4 to DEFCON 3. That's really butch. And Bush was scheduled to give a speech the next day anyway, so the administration said, well, the vice president will announce our response to this. And suddenly, everyone in the media wanted to come. We were beating them away with sticks. And I thought, this is great. This is my moment. It's come. This is all about me. You see, I have a proper sense of perspective. Nuclear war, me. Nuclear war, me. I can't decide. As Jack Benny would say, I'm thinking. So, you know, I wrote the speech, and being a highly intellectual, highly educated person, I went to Bartlett's Familiar Quotations and found a quote from Thucydides. It seemed good enough, you know. It's always nice to have a little classical parsley, you know, sort of on the thing. As Thucydides said. Ugh. And so, day of the speech, and comes, and the entire world media is there. And Bush is doing great. He was such a lovely man, Mr. Bush. And then he got to the Thucydides line, and something happened. He said, as the Greek historian he's like, I need a consonant here. And he was like a parrot with a piece of banana stuck in his throat. He'd go, ooh, ooh. And I was seated at this staff table with Admiral Murphy. Admiral Murphy was the 4-star Navy admiral who was Mr. Bush's chief of staff. And I had been with Benedictine monks at boarding school for 4 years, and I thought I knew about figures of authority. And then I went to work for a 4-star Navy admiral, and boy, are they strict, you know. And Admiral Murphy is like glowering at me, and I'm going, I didn't make up this word. And Bush is going, ooh, ooh. It was like being in Lamaze class. I was going, you know, push. Push, come on, you can do it. Push. And finally it sort of slipped, it plopped out, and it said it is. And afterwards, Admiral Murphy came up and he poked me in the chest with his finger and said, next time say Plato. And that was the beginning of the Platonic era of rhetoric. Oh, we quoted Plato a lot after that. But Random House said, no, no, we can't call it thu. You know, no one's, you know, they won't know how to spell it, you know. So by now, everyone's sort of angry and numb. I was, you know, Homer's dead, Shakespeare's dead, and I myself am not feeling at all well, as Twain said. So I said, okay, let's cut the, you know what, let's just call it, wish I'd said that. Can you figure that out? This was from a piece in the book. It was a piece I'd written for All Things Considered. I had been summoned for jury duty in Washington, and there was nothing really more, no more deplorable sight in this rich democracy of ours than 72 grown-ups trying to wiggle out of doing their civic duty. You know, I have a dentist appointment on Tuesday. Murder trial? Moi? No. So we were all in voir dire, which is French for interminable process that makes you regret ever having registered to vote. And we were all trying to get out, and the judge was interrogating us and, you know, sort of listening to our pathetic excuses. But he then said, well, does anyone here have any connection with law enforcement? And I was married to a CIA officer. So I saw my opening. But as you know from the Scooter Libby Valerie Plame thing, it's not a good idea to stand up in a crowd. I'm married to a CIA officer. We live at 3516 Newark Street, and she works something to do with plutonium. I could get her down here. Her phone number is... so I didn't want to do that, you know. So I raised my hand. And the judge looked at me and said, yes. I said, Your Honor, may I approach? I'd seen this on Law and Order. And he said, approach. I thought, cool. So I approached and spent the next 3 weeks on the jury. But I was telling a friend of mine about this, my big moment, you know, in court. And he had served with the Green Berets in Vietnam. And he said, he listened patiently to my story, and he said, yeah, it's kind of like the first time I got to say, cover me. Which, you know, kind of put my moment in perspective. But it got me to thinking that, you know, a lot of us, maybe even most of us, don't get to say the really cool lines that you hear in the movies, like, you know, charge, or sponge, clamp, sutures, or the defense rests, or, you know, 3, 2, 1, ignition, liftoff. I mean, how cool would that be? Or like, up periscope. In my case, it probably would have been down periscope after ramming some innocent Japanese research vessel off Hawaii. And let's get the hell out of here. But what about survivors, Captain Buckley? Screw the survivors. This is my career. Sometimes when I get home, I call my wife from the airport and I say, the Eagle has landed. To which he usually says, well, that's great. Tell the eagle to pick up a quart of milk on the way home. But I'll close with a allegedly true story about there was a Scottish magistrate. And the town drunk had been summoned before him for the umpteenth time. And he was just sick of seeing this guy in his courtroom. So he looked down from the bench over his glasses, you know, sort of like this, and he said, McIntyre, he said, you have been found guilty of the crime of public drunkenness, and it is the sentence of this court that you be taken from here to the place of execution, and there hanged by your neck until you're dead. And may God Almighty have mercy upon your soul. Well, McIntyre fainted. And the bailiff sort of looked up at the judge like this, and the judge said, I just always wanted to say that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You're a very well-behaved audience. I've been asked by my very gracious host to take a few questions, if you have any, maybe about bulk purchases of the book. I think we're limiting them tonight to 25 per customer. I think. Sorry, if it were me. I'll just pace. There's a question.
You have an excellent delivery. I just wondered, did you take any drama classes at Yale?
From Daisha.
He's a very quick study.
Well, I grew up around two pretty dramatic people, my mom and dad. You know, my dad spoke here, by the way. I don't know if it was part of this lecture series, but he did give his final speech in Fort Wayne. He was frequently asked why he sounded the way he did. You probably saw Firing Line, and you know, he had that sort of, you know, he was much imitated. You know, they did a lot of impersonations of him. You know, mutatis mutandis, non quod licet bov, non licet Jove. But the answer is English was his third language. Yeah, his father was from Texas. That's not a laugh line. You're really good. You're good. Here. No, my dad's dad was the son of a Texas sheriff, whose best friend was Pat Garrett, the man who shot Billy the Kid. And my grandmother was from New Orleans. And so he had a Texas father and a Texas mother, and he grew up speaking Spanish because they had lived in Mexico. So all the nannies spoke Spanish, so Spanish was the language. And then when he was 6, they went to live in France for a year, so he learned French. He knew no English at this point. William F. Buckley, the great vocabularian, knew no English at age 6. And then his parents sort of looked at each other and said, well, I guess we ought to teach him English. So he went to school in England for a year. My mother was Canadian from British Columbia. So I was 8 years old before I figured out we weren't English. Cab drivers in New York say, oh, what part of England are you from? I say, New England. So that's why I sound the way I do. Is a question back there, or I saw someone move around. No sudden hand movements.
Who or what inspired you to write on political issues, like be a satirist on political issues?
I'm sorry, dear. Can you repeat that?
Who or what inspired you to write on political issues?
The bank. That owns my house. Well, that's a flip answer. I went to, I did work at the White House, and everyone who works at the White House writes, for more than 5 minutes, writes a 500-page book about it. Usually with the word power in the title, like power and me. And these books, I began to read a lot of these memoirs because they're sort of a fascinating little subgenre. And they all have pretty much two themes. First, it wasn't my fault. And the second is, it would have been much worse if I hadn't been there. So I left, and no one particular. The world was not. The world may have been dying for a book called Bass Holes, but it was not dying for my memoir about being a speechwriter to a vice president. Wow, brace yourselves. So I wrote, but I wanted to write something about, because I had seen, it's an interesting seat at the circus. So I wrote a comic novel, which was a parody, basically, of a White House memoir. It's called The White House Mess. And I wrote it in 1984, and I set it in an administration 4 years in the future. And it starts with the new president arriving at the White House to escort then retiring President Reagan to the Capitol for the transition, for the swearing in. And it's weird, but Reagan has in my novel has gone a bit dotty and won't leave. And I thought, this would be an interesting situation. You arrive, oh, Mr. President, may I escort you? And he's still in his pajamas. And then, in 1994, he got Alzheimer's and wrote that really heartbreaking farewell to the American people, which is impossible to read without tears coming to your eyes. But he was a very good sport about it. I was a little worried when the book came out. And I was on book tour, and I remember I was going to a radio interview at the outskirts of Pennsylvania, of Philadelphia. There was, for some reason, in the Campbell Soup Factory. I don't know. And these were the days before cell phones, and the taxi pulls up to the gate, and the Campbell's guard, with this, clipboard, who have you got there? And he says, oh, some guy named Buckley. He goes, Christopher Buckley? And I go, yes, I'm here to do the interview for the radio show that no one listens to. And he said, Mrs. Reagan is trying to reach you. The famous White House operators. They could find you on the far side of the moon. I thought, oh. Because Nancy Reagan was not famously amused by things like this. Oh, so you have Ronnie, my husband has gone mentally ill. Isn't that nice? Isn't that special? So my bowels loosened. And please call the White House operator. And I called, and she said, oh, I hear you have a new book out. I go, yeah. And all she wanted to do was talk about Patty, who had done something terrible for the 18th time. And then he very sweetly wrote me a letter, Reagan did, saying that he congratulated me on the new book and was pleased to play a role in it. What a huge, big-hearted guy. And I was going, oh. Well, I hope that answers your question.
So, Mr. Buckley, when will we see Bass Holes on the bookshelves?
I'm sorry. I think I heard a word in there. Did you say bass holes?
Well, seriously, the question is there another book in the works, and can you offer us any clues about it?
Oh, another book in the works. Well, yeah. I'm doing the military-industrial complex next. Part of the problem, if you write satire, I mean, once you're known to write satire, not all that many people want to talk to you. You call up the Pentagon and say, "Oh, I'd like to hang out with the Joint Chiefs." You know, Buckley? Yeah. You writing a book? Yeah, it's a serious book about, you know, what you guys do. I'll call you back. Yeah, I thought I'd try to have some fun with that. Yes, ma'am. Next question.
First of all, I didn't think you would have such a wonderful sense of humor, so I'm really
Thank
pleased.
you. Thank you.
Well, I did grow up watching your dad on firing line, so I'm really impressed. But my question is more as a political commentator and as a political observer. You know, you've stated that most of the evil in the world is done by people who want to pay or who need to pay their mortgage. Right. And I was just wondering if you could give us your insight on what you think about the people who have brought our economy to where we are now, and in terms of their needing to pay their mortgages. So thanks.
Did you all hear the question? It was a very long question. The answer is you can only buy 10 copies of each book. As I was on my way to the airport today, I opened the Washington Post, and Alan Greenspan was apparently testified before the Senate yesterday, and the theme was, what are you talking about? Yeah. And he said, remember, for 30 years, Alan Greenspan was the smartest guy in the room. My theory was that no one could understand what he was actually saying. He's famously, he mumbles. He goes, well, there are encouraging signs, but irrational exuberances. Maybe what he was actually saying was, sell all your stocks, sell. For the love of God, get out of the market. I'll tell you a funny story. For a change. Enough but seriously. That's something I don't say a lot, but seriously. A cousin of mine, I shouldn't be too precise about this, a cousin of mine does PR. He's a Washington player and a very good guy. And he does public relations. And one of his clients was Goldman Sachs. You've heard of them, right? And he told me he was at an off-site. That's Washingtonese for, a meeting that's so secret you can't have it in the office. We have to scurry away. And this was the summer before the crash. This was the summer of, it's like August of 2008. 6 weeks before the economy melted. And it was an all-day thing, and all the top guys at Goldman Sachs were giving a presentation about what was next. Well, we're in subprimes now, then we're going to do auto loans, and then college loans. We think those can be securitized, and we're going to securitize everything. If it moves, securitize it. And after the meeting, they were all sort of relaxing with the, drink, and someone said to the top Goldman Sachs guy, Bob, what have you got your money in right now? He said, cash and ammunition. Cash and ammunition. And my cousin said to me, how stupid was I? Not when I got home that night, not to call my broker and say, sell everything. They're the smartest people in the room. Yes, sir.
I was hoping you would discuss with us your decision to defect from family tradition and endorse Obama. How difficult was it to come out publicly? Come out of the closet.
Yeah. Did anyone ever tell you you have very nice shoulders? You know, honestly, I didn't think anyone would care what I thought. It was a blog. I mounted what I thought was an argument, not just, you know, I think this was about October 10th, and I've been a friend of John McCain since 1982, but I was very seriously concerned by his campaign, and to be honest, very seriously concerned by his choice for vice president. And I'd read Obama's books, and I have a thing for people who can write well. Anyway, you know, if I may channel my dad's ghost for a moment, that's tricky. Hamlet tried it, it didn't work out. Everyone ended up dead on stage. But you know, my dad did surprising things. He was the father of the modern conservative movement, sure, but his views were often surprising. You know, his to say nothing of his personal relations, some of his best friends were liberals. John Kenneth Galbraith was a great friend. Ira Glasser, head of the ACLU. When, in 1976, my Uncle Jimmy, who was then a U.S. Senator from New York, was running for re-election, and it was not going well. My dad endorsed Al Lowenstein for Congress. Al Lowenstein was so far to the left of my dad that he wouldn't have been able to find him with a Hubble telescope. But he admired Al, and he thought he was a principled guy. And so he went outside the box, and this landed hard in certain quarters. And then in 1980, he endorsed Joe Lieberman for Senate. So what I'm trying to say is, I don't think we should have, go completely, have Tippi Hedren moments when someone makes an argument for voting for someone for the other side. I think what's happened, I think, and maybe, these TV and the internet have enabled this, is that we now sink ourselves into silos where we will only meet people we agree with. And everything we say will be positively reinforced. How else account for, you've seen these blogs, I mean, they're, or the TV shows. I was on a panel with David Brooks the other day, who's probably one of the most thoughtful people writing, and he's center right, kind of like me. He's just smarter. And he said nice things about Obama and said some very serious things about Sarah Palin. He called her a cancer on the Republican Party. But we were talking about Fox News and the Glenn Becks and the Rush Limbaughs and he related this statistic which I found sort of breathtaking. He said more people in America own ferrets than listen to Fox News. I said, where did you come up with that? But it's true. We get alarmed by this, but it reaches relatively small numbers. And and Rush Limbaugh, he has a huge podium, Rush, and he is but people don't do what he tells them to do. He said, go out and vote for Hillary Clinton, just to, people didn't do that. I think people view, he and Glenn Beck and Sean Hannity, these are entertainers. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. I hope that answers your question. I think I went right to the heart of it, too. We have time for one more? Maybe two more. There's a lady there. I think she's gone to sleep, standing up. Yes.
Dr. Charlesworth won't be surprised that I want to end the night with a reading list, but earlier you said, earlier at the student Q&A, you mentioned that as you've grown older, you've grown less ideological. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if someone was building a non-ideological reading list from syndicated columnists, who would you?
That's actually a very good question. For economics, Robert Samuelson. David Brooks, I find, although David, I mean, he's some notches to the right of Obama, but that would not stop him from saying something approving about someone who, I mean, they're out there. What I look for is unpredictability. I think there's some columnists you just don't bother reading because you know exactly what they're going to say. I think I greatly admire George Will, and although he is of the right, he is rigorous intellectually. So they're out there. It seems like sort of when you turn on the TV and you see these barking circuses, it seems like a pretty noisy agora these days. But there are pockets. There are little areopagi scattered around. There's some smart discourse going on out there. And so, the lady who is not asleep, she is.
Well, maybe I'm asking the same question. Your father was a Republican that Democrats liked. And I just wonder, are there any Republicans like him anymore?
Yeah, there was this guy in, is Fred. Let me close. I hope that answers your question. This being where we are, Indiana, I have to close with one of my favorite stories. It was about a very dear friend of mine named Michael Kelly, who was a journalist. He was editor of the Atlantic Monthly, and he was killed in Iraq, in Baghdad, in the early days, and killed in a very horrible way. But at his memorial service, Maureen Dowd told this story. Michael, it was the day after the general election in 1988, and Michael had been covering the Dukakis campaign for 5 months, and so they had all, he and the other journos had gone out and gotten really good and drunk after the election results came in. So now it's 7:30 in the morning, and he's being interviewed by Brian Lamb, your own Brian Lamb, a wonderful, wonderful guy who invented C-SPAN. And it's 7:30 in the morning, and Michael is so dreadfully hungover that all he can do is sort of try not to throw up on Brian Lamb's shoes. And Brian Lamb, who had this sort of Zen-like way of interrogation, is peppering him with questions, and he says, do you attach any special significance to the election last night of Evan Bayh? And Michael had never heard of Evan Bayh. But in the best tradition of journalism, American journalism, he decided to soldier through and said, no, I attach no special significance to the election of Evan Bayh. And Brian Lamb said, even though he's the first Democrat elected governor of Indiana in 50 years? And Michael said, oh, that Evan Bayh.